Hello, my name is Tamika Brown, and I'm the director of ECMC's The College Place, located in Richmond, Virginia. And today I'm excited to give a talk that's going to update folks on the changes to the FAFSA. It's called the Better FAFSA Project, and essentially, the FAFSA will be changing. The free application for federal student aid will be changing for the 2024-2025 academic year. And so this talk is to give you information about what the changes are and how you can prepare families for this year's FAFSA season. So what am I going to go over? I'm going to talk first about the FAFSA Simplification Act as well as the Future Act and how they kind of inform the changes that are coming. Timeline of FAFSA updates coming from federal student aid as well as NCAN that's providing some resources. Why is the FAFSA changing? I'll talk about the particular populations of the public that will benefit from the changes to the FAFSA. Then I'll go over the bulk of the talk will be going over relevant changes to high school students and the families who will be completing the FAFSA this fall. And then lastly, tips for planning, how to move forward in this season where we're trying to figure out what's next. We know the FAFSA is not rolling out until December, but we want to make sure you're informed so you can prepare accordingly. So the two acts that are informing the change for the FAFSA is first, the FAFSA Simplification Act of 2020. The purpose of this overhaul was to decrease the amount of questions, reduce the amount of questions on the FAFSA from 108 to 36. And so I'll say that the amount of questions have actually stayed the same. They just moved them into groups. So it's 36 groups of questions, if that makes sense. Next, the Future Act of 2019 allows the IRS to share information directly with federal student aid. And the goal is to improve the function of the FAFSA, make it easier for folks to transfer information from the IRS to federal student aid, and decrease the likelihood of students being chosen for verification. Here's a screen grab of the homepage of the FAFSA. We were fortunate enough to get some information from FSA a couple weeks ago that shared just kind of screen grabs of the application. And this is what the homepage is going to look like. But why is the FAFSA changing? One, they wanted to create a more streamlined application process for students, expand eligibility for federal financial aid, and we do know that they've increased the income protection amount for certain subsets of the population, reduce barriers for certain populations, better user experience with the actual form, and then decrease the need for verification with the Future Act and now being able to connect directly to the IRS. So the shift in aid eligibility is going to go from cash flow, which is income, to actual wealth, assets. So they're not necessarily leaning as much as they have historically into how much the family is bringing in terms of their income, but they're trying to figure out the money that they have saved or invested, how much of that money can be used towards college expenses. The new changes are supposed to increase the number of Pell eligible students by 500,000. And 500,000, that's a lot. Up to 7.4 million students will be able to access the new FAFSA. I mean, be able to access the Pell Grant through the new FAFSA. So we're really excited about that. So while the overhaul may seem a bit cumbersome for those of us who know what the last FAFSA looks like, and we're trying to compare the changes now, the new changes though are going to be really beneficial to so many folks. There is no asset reporting for students or families who meet the simplified needs test. So that is if anyone in their household receives SSI, SNAP, TANF, WIC, Medicaid, or federal housing assistance. Please note that the free and reduced lunch program is no longer included as a part of the simplified needs test. In the past, it has been included, but because so many school districts are now getting free and reduced lunch for their entire district because of the high percentage of students that may qualify within that district historically, it's not necessarily becoming a metric that they can use to determine what students may qualify for that federal assistance. Also, no asset reporting for families whose income is less than 60K. I mentioned earlier about the income protection allowance that was increased. So they increased the income protection allowance by 20% for parents, 35% for most students, and 60% for students who are single parents, which I think is great. That is absolutely great. What is the timeline that we're looking forward to for this fall? NCAN and FSA have both released a lot of great resources online. There's counselor training and fact sheets, different webinars that we see going around, even this particular talk. But please take advantage of those resources that exist. Even the sample deck, they actually just released kind of a mock-up of the deck. I mean, a mock-up of the actual application 2 weeks ago, where you can use a login and move around the application. So become comfortable with it. We don't imagine any major changes happening for that application between now and December, when it's going to be released. So I encourage you to kind of tap into those resources to grow more comfortable with using them, because when it's released in December, we're going to hit the ground running. So it's supposed to be released by law by January 1st, 2024. So we know for certain that it's going to be released before the new year. But something to note, next year, we're going back to the October 1st release date. So the release date in December that's happening this year is only for the 2024-2025 FAFSA. When the 25-26 FAFSA becomes available, it's going to go back to October the 1st. So moving forward in this talk, I'm going to kind of present the relevant changes to the FAFSA in a way that's comparing the current FAFSA to the changes that we're anticipating. I also add a category to explain just kind of why those particular changes were made. Just as a disclaimer, everything in this talk is as updated as September 2023. There hasn't been any changes since September 2023, although it is now October. But due to the evolving nature of the new FAFSA rollout, though, the information is tentative and it still may change. Although it's unlikely, it still may change before the FAFSA is rolled out in December. So they've made some changes to vocabulary, the terminology we use in the FAFSA, to make it clearer for folks to understand aspects of the application. So currently, the FAFSA produces a number known as the expected family contribution. It's calculated based on the family income and financial information that's submitted on the FAFSA. The lowest EFC currently is a 0. And when 2 or more students from the same household, same family are enrolled in college, their EFC is divided among them. That is changing. With the new FAFSA, they're going back to an old term that they used back in the day, the SAI, Student Aid Index. And that's the new term used for the calculation produced from the FAFSA. The lowest SAI a student can have is a negative 1,500. And the SAI will not be divided among a household if 2 or more students are actually enrolled in college. Another change is they shifted from the term room and board to food and housing to be more inclusive of students who live off campus. Those students still have to figure out their living expenses, although they may not be living in a dorm or having a meal plan. So they changed that language from room and board to food and housing. And they also created they gave guidelines around how many meals should be included in the cost of attendance. So it must include 21 meals per week to make sure students are eating adequately daily. Another change is they're shifting from household size to family size. Now, this shift is in alignment with essentially who will report information on the FAFSA with the student if the student is a dependent student. Historically, students reported their household size to include their parent, any dependent siblings, or other people who are supported by the dependent student's parents. Well, now they shift to family size, and this information will be imported directly from the IRS tax information. But if for some reason the family size differs from what the IRS has, that is one of the few areas that's coming directly from the IRS that a family can manually change within the FAFSA application. So just know that they're no longer focusing on the household, they're focusing specifically on the family size. And that will be informed by who the student's contributor is. And we'll talk in a moment about what a contributor is. Another change, and it's more so a change in process and expectation. With the current FAFSA, after a student submits the application, they receive something known as their student aid report, the SAR. And the SAR gives an estimated family contribution. So students can kind of have a ballpark figure of how much federal student aid has determined that their family should be able to contribute to their college expenses. But there's going to be a shift. Students will no longer receive a SAR. They will receive a FAFSA summary submission. They do not want that shortened to FSS. but a FAFSA summary submission, and that document will be available to the student within 1 to 3 days of actually submitting the FAFSA. That summary submission will show their SAI, and also give other information that they may find relevant. A lot of the information that was already on the student aid report, but is going to be on the FAFSA submission summary now instead. Another change that I'm excited about is really defining what these two categories mean in terms of FAFSA. Historically, students could share an unusual or special circumstance with college to determine their dependency status, but what they defined as unusual and special circumstance was very vague and cryptic. By building relationships with financial aid offices, we came to understand how some schools define it, but it was never really a definition that was applied across the board that everyone used to determine what are unusual circumstances and what are special circumstances. So federal student aid actually took the time to define these two terms. So a special circumstance is when a student has changes in their finances that may warrant a change in their in their EFC or COA or SAI. So special circumstance would affect how much they would have to pay towards school, how much their cost of attendance will be at that school. Unusual circumstance will be if a student has a condition that will warrant a change to their dependency status. So they have a change in their life that may change in their condition that may qualify them to be an independent student, and so they will qualify for a dependency override. That's different from special. So just to reiterate, special circumstances when there's been a change in the money. Unusual circumstances when there's a change in a student's condition that then may warrant a change in their dependency status. Another change is how students are going to be able to, the way they're encouraging students to be able to complete the FAFSA. Historically, the fastest has always been known, the fastest way to submit the FAFSA is to do it online using an FSA ID. Students and their dependents, students, and if they are dependents, their parents will create an FSA ID using their birthday, social security number, and their legal full name. And then they're able to create an FSA ID and complete and submit the FAFSA online. They also have been able to access a paper version of the FAFSA to be able to complete by hand and then mail it to federal student aid. Well, the new changes, they're using the language that both students and parents will be required to create an FSA ID, although we do know that the paper FAFSA still will be available for student use. So they want to encourage folks to use the web-based application because, again, it decreased the likelihood of being chosen for verification due to now the direct connection to the IRS database. But the paper FAFSA is still available and may be the easier route for some families, depending on what their circumstance is. In the past, it's been possible to submit a FAFSA without an FSA ID. So it's possible to go through the whole process without having an email address from a parent. Well, to create an FSA ID now, parents, because now they want all parents who are completing information on a student's FAFSA to have an FSA ID, the parent must be sure to have a unique email address and a unique phone number so that they can create an FSA ID. This must be unique to what the student has. So if the student and the parent shares an email address or share a phone number, I encourage them to create a second one. They can use Google to create a Google number, and they can create another email address. But it has to be a unique email address and a unique phone number to create a FSA ID for a parent. Okay, so this is one of the changes that I've just kind of leaned into learning more about because I want to make sure that I was informed about all the information so that we can best support students from migrant communities. So historically, parents who did not have a social security number were not able to create an FSA ID. Instead, the student who was a US citizen completed the FAFSA and printed out the signature form and made it available for their parent to sign it and then mail it to federal student aid. Now, parents without social security numbers will be able to still create an FSA ID by going through an ID verification process with federal student aid. They're using TransUnion, which is the credit agency, to verify identifying documents for parents who do not have Social Security numbers. But if they're not able to go through that process with TransUnion, there will be a process for them to upload their documents directly into a portal with federal student aid. And so they'll be able to manually submit those identifying documents directly to federal student aid if they're not able to use that process through TransUnion. When this originally came up, I was concerned because I felt uncertain that we could guarantee immigrant families that we could protect them, particularly those who were undocumented. We could protect them from any undue attention, I guess, from going through the federal student aid FAFSA completion process. But in my research, I found that federal law prohibits the use of data collecting through the FAFSA for anything other than calculating federal and state financial aid. So no other agency in the federal government can tap into this FAFSA information to penalize a family for anything. Another change that's really exciting, historically, the FAFSA has been available in both English and Spanish, and now they've increased the amount of languages that are available in both the form as well as resources and translation services to the 11 most common spoken languages in the US. That's a game changer, because not only are they making the application more available and more accessible for students, but also parents who may not know English well, they'll be able to understand the application themselves independently. So I think this is an awesome new addition to the application for sure. Another big change this year is who the FAFSA parent is. Now, in the past, we've used the term FAFSA parent or FAFSA parent or financial aid parent, to define the parent with whom a dependent student will provide their financial information on the FAFSA. That term is changing this year to be contributor. The contributor will be the person who will be providing that information. So for a dependent student, currently, if the parent who the student lives with more than 50% of the time is considered to be the contributing parent or the FAFSA parent. That's how it is now. For a dependent student, they determine who the student lives with. Now, the FAFSA is changing though. The new FAFSA will consider the parent that contributes the most financially to the student. So it's not about where the student lives. It's about who provides the most financial support for the student. In a dependent situation where the student is living with one of their natural or adoptive parents. This may be determined by the person who claims the student as a dependent on their taxes. If that's not the case, then the family may have to work directly with the school's financial aid office to work through those details. But I think the assumption has been if a parent is providing the majority of financial support, then this parent will also be claiming the student on their taxes. But we know that that's not always the case with every family. But I think that's going to be the assumption, which is why they're pulling all of that information directly from the IRS. One change, though, that matters with this is that any child support received by the FAFSA contributor parent will not be included as income. It will not be considered as income. Now, it may be considered as an asset, but is no longer considered as income to be used for college education. So a little bit more about FAFSA contributors. So a FAFSA contributor is someone who must provide their financial information on a student FAFSA. Here's the screen graph that the students will see at the point in the application where they have to share information about who their contributors may be. Each contributor, just to take a step back, a contributor could be a spouse, it could be a natural or adoptive parent, or a step parent. So they moved away from FAFSA parent because if someone's contributor is a spouse, they're not their parent, they're just contributing information on the FAFSA. Each contributor must have an FSA ID in order to complete the FAFSA online. And when the student includes someone as a contributor on the FAFSA, FSA ID will then send them an email inviting them to complete their section of the FAFSA. If after the contributor completes their section, the student will then log back in and then submit the application online. That's going to be the process. So the new FAFSA is role specific. The student is only going to see their part of the FAFSA and contributors are only going to see their part of the FAFSA. No one's going to be able to see each other's part. Although the student will be able to keep up with the status or the progress that parents or contributors are making on in their particular section of the application. So here is what it's going to look like when students get to the screen where they input information about who their contributors are, they'll ask for the contributor's first and last name, date of birth, social security number, as well as email address. If it's a two-parent household, then they'll provide information for both of those parents. But if both parents are married, both don't have to provide their information. Both don't have to log in to do it. Only one will have one is able. I'll say that only one person is able to log in and provide the information for all of the parents, for both of the parents. Although both parents will get the invitation. So let me just explain that again. When students list, if students live with two parents, they will list both parents on the FAFSA. Both parents, they encourage both parents to get an FSA ID, and both parents will receive the invitation to complete the FAFSA. But in a situation where it's a two-parent household, only one of the parents needs to go and log into the FAFSA website, complete the parent financial section, and then submit their section of the application. Both parents don't need to do it. On the student status page, essentially when they're working through the application, there'll be opportunities for them to check on the status of different parts of the app. This is the bottom of the student status page, which shows what's going on with parents or their contributors. So here you can see the date that the student sent their invitation and just kind of what the status is of the invitation. It will say in progress, it will say completed as parents move through it. Also, the final screen after a student completes their section of the FAFSA will look like the screen you see on the right. Well, again, it tells the status of the parent sections, and it just kind of gives them next steps for what to anticipate as they await the opportunity to finally submit their application. For dependent students, the contributor is the person who provides the majority of the student's financial support. So I think it's important, excuse me, to go through the details of determining like who would be a contributor for a student. One of the key changes this year is that marital separation must be legal and not informal. If the parents are divorced, then that counts as divorce. They are divorced. But if there's a situation where parents report that they are separated, but they're not legally separated or they're not legally divorced, then they have to still report the information as married. And then they can work directly with the school's financial aid office to prove that they maybe lived in a separate residence and have a separate address for the past 12 months. But if a student is living with both parents, whether the parents are married or live together, both parents will report their information on the FAFSA. If the student lives with one of their natural or adoptive parents, the parent that provides the majority of the student's financial support will be considered the FAFSA contributor. If that parent, and it doesn't matter if that parent is in the household or not, that parent could be outside of the household and still provide the majority of the student's financial support, so that parent is the FAFSA contributor. Now, if that parent is married and there's a step parent involved, the step parent is also a FAFSA contributor and must provide their information for the application. So yeah, we just want to make sure folks are clear on that. And it doesn't matter if the step parent is not in the household with the student, it's that household. Also, another point to add, when they're considering household family size, I mentioned earlier, they're not using household, they're using family size. When students are counting up their family size, because this information is coming directly from the IRS, from their contributors' tax information, they will count the contributors' family size as their family size. So if the contributor is not in the household, they will consider that household of the contributor to be their family size that they will be reporting on the FAFSA. Other changes, they've changed the amount of schools or colleges that a student can list on the FAFSA to receive their financial information. Historically, students have been able to list 10 schools. Now they can list up to 20 at a time on the FAFSA. I still don't encourage students to apply to more than 10 schools at a time, but there are some who are very adamant about casting their net. So students can submit list up to 20 colleges on their FAFSA, and they can also still resubmit the FAFSA if they want more than 20 schools to receive their information, or they've submitted their application and realized that there was a school that they wanted to include or that they didn't. They're still able to resubmit the FAFSA after it's been processed by federal student aid. Also, as I mentioned earlier, historically, we've used the IRS data retrieval tool, but it's been optional And it's reduced the likelihood of students being chosen for verification, but it's no longer optional. It is required now. All tax information will be transferred directly from the IRS now, reducing the number of students selected for verification. But in order to do that, both students and contributors must provide consent on the FAFSA for the IRS transfer to be able to happen. This is a requirement to be eligible for federal financial aid. It's not an option. Even if the family does not report any income, and even if the student is not working, both parties must still provide consent so that their financial information can be pulled from the IRS, and it is a requirement to be eligible for federal student aid. Another note about consent, this is essentially the language that they're using on the FAFSA. This is a screen grab from the section that talks about consent, but students and contributors must provide consent regardless of their tax status and their method of FAFSA submission. So that means if a family is choosing to do the paper FAFSA, they still have to provide consent for federal student aid to pull their information from the IRS. There will be opportunities throughout the FAFSA. Please pay close attention to this. There will be many opportunities throughout the FAFSA where they will say, we'll give students the opportunity and contributors the opportunity to either provide consent or decline consent. A student can decline consent and still move through the application. A student can decline a student can decline consent and still submit the application, but they will not be eligible for federal student aid if they do not provide consent. So please do not be deceived by the opportunities to hit decline, especially because you'll still be able to move through the application. No, they have to provide consent to be considered for aid. Another change that's happening is how they're calculating Pell eligibility. Historically, Pell has been determined by the student's expected family contribution. Now they're determining by two factors. So one, the poverty tables that exist, they'll be used to determine eligibility for the minimum and maximum Pell Grant. And we work through the numbers in a moment. I'll show you just kind of what those numbers will look like for students to be eligible for the Pell Grant. And all other Pell Grant amounts will be awarded based on the student's SAI. So it's not just based on SAI, it's based on SAI and poverty tables now. What this may mean, though, is that two different students with the same SAI will receive different Pell Grant amounts if their family income and size place them on different points of the poverty table. This year, the maximum Pell Grant will be $7,395. And we kind of work through those numbers so that folks can have some idea what this looks like. So just as an example of Pell eligibility based on financial aid status and household status in a single household size in a single parent family. So if the family size is 2, which is a student and a parent, the maximum income a family could have to qualify for the maximum amount of Pell is $41,198. And they will continue to be Pell eligible up until the income of $59,508. So to qualify for Pell, it could be from $0 to $59,508 for a family of 2. And to qualify for the maximum Pell amount, the $73,995, $7,395. Sheesh, I'm moving the comma everywhere. $7,395. The most money that a family of 2 can make is $41,198. So that kind of gives you the example of family size 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you can have some perspective around. I'm often asked that. What's the maximum amount a family can make to qualify for Pell? And here are the numbers just as they are. But just be mindful. I know a lot of families look at these numbers and they're like, I'm not going to be eligible for a Pell Grant, so I'm not going to complete the FAFSA. There are so many more opportunities for financial aid beyond the Pell Grant that students will have access to by completing the FAFSA. So don't let this deter any of your families from completing the FAFSA because they may not be eligible for the Pell Grant. Other relevant FAFSA changes for financials. Families will no longer have to report any cash support or other monies paid on the student's behalf. That used to be a question on the FAFSA on the student financials page. They no longer will have to report the veterans education benefits or workman's compensation. Child support, as I mentioned earlier, will be reported as an asset instead of income. And families must also report all of their small businesses and family farms. But a note about that, they need to report the net value of businesses and family farms. So if the family is in the red, if they owe debt, you should subtract the amount of debt from the value of the business and the family farm, and then report that as the value, the net value of those two entities. So after the FAFSA is submitted, essentially students, as I mentioned earlier, students will have 1 to 3 business days, and they'll get an email with their FAFSA summary submission, FAFSA submission summary, excuse me, that lists their SAI as well. One thing to note though, after a student starts a FAFSA, they have 45 days to submit it. So that's 45 days for them to do their section, their contributors to do their section, and the students to hit submit. After 45 days, the system is wiped clean and the student has to start over. So please encourage students and families to get it done after the student starts the application so they don't have to start it over from the beginning. Also, colleges can still use information collected on the FAFSA to determine institutional aid eligibility. So again, that's the added benefit of completing the FAFSA for students who may not be Pell eligible. They will be considered for financial aid at their respective institutions where they're enrolling in college. Here's a screen grab of the FAFSA confirmation page. Essentially, upon submitting the FAFSA, it's going to give them next steps. It's going to tell them what they can expect, how long they can wait for processing, and just some more tidbits of information is going to be helpful. But essentially, I just want to show you what the screen is going to look like for students when they submit the FAFSA. Other things you may want to be aware of. Historically, it's been reported that it takes students about 45 minutes to complete the FAFSA. Well, they're saying for the new FAFSA, it's going to take them about an hour to complete the FAFSA. So pack on some patience. Parents can still start and submit a FAFSA without a student's consent or signature. The student still has to provide consent at some point to be considered for federal aid, but the parent can complete the application as well. They've shifted how the order of questions. Dependency questions will come first. Those are the questions that they're trying to figure out if a student has a contributor or not. In the past, that's been probably the third section on the FAFSA application. Now it's at the beginning of the application. And you may remember last year, those of you who may have worked with students last year for completing the FAFSA, there was a survey towards the end of the application before you would sign and submit that would gather gender and race information about the students. Students could choose not to answer. But now those survey questions are now required for all students to complete. Federal Student Aid said that it gives them more robust and rich data around the types of students who complete the FAFSA and keep up with the process of their progress with actually completing the application. So what are some anticipated errors that we're expecting with our knowledge of kind of how students move through the FAFSA and young people and families? Just kind of what are some of the common FAFSA errors we've seen historically, but also things that we're anticipating with the new changes? One, not using their legal name per the Social Security Administration. This will definitely flag a student if they're not using the name that's issued, that they've given the Social Security Administration, SSA, then they will not be verified, so they won't be able to complete the FAFSA. Also, listing incorrect contributor information could be an error, especially because last year, it may change for some students who live in a single parent household. Last year, they reported who they lived with the majority of the year. This year, they're reporting who provides the majority of their financial support, and it may be a different parent. So make sure that they're listing the correct contributor. Also, incorrect tax filing status for contributors. In years past, federal student aid is kind of when there's been an incorrect filing status for a family, they haven't really raised a red flag. But last year, we actually saw them raise, give a pop-up essentially. If, for example, if there is a two-parent household and both parents filed head of household, that's not legal. And so now if that happens, if that comes up where our student is completing the FAFSA, they will be flagged. The website encourages them to file an amended tax return before they're able to submit the FAFSA. So we really try to encourage folks to make sure that's correct before FAFSA season comes, because they will flag you. Also, refusing the IRS tax tax transcript consent. I mentioned earlier, there are going to be many opportunities throughout the application to decline consent. Do not be deceived. They have to provide consent to be eligible for aid. So please, everyone do it, regardless of your tax status, regardless of how you're submitting the application, regardless if you earned income. You have to provide consent. Next, manually submitting financial information to the same point of providing consent. There will be a section on the FAFSA where students can click a button to manually submit their families, their parents' financial information. And it gives them the opportunity to do it. But if the parent has not provided consent, that information still will not be considered, and the student will not be eligible for federal aid. So again, don't be deceived by those options. Also, not counting all dependents in the family size. Some students may be confusing, again, last year, household size to family size. So make sure that they're counting the correct household in their family size. And again, that's the family size of their contributor. Incomplete contributor section, I'm really concerned about this, to be honest, because now that the parent has to log in independent of the student, they have to wait to get an email to invite them to do it, log in, complete their section, and then the student has to log back in. I'm fearful that someone's going to drop the ball in this process. Students are going to forget FSAID's name and password. Parents are going to kind of get busy and lose track of the actual email to complete the contributor section. So I would encourage you to really push parents to get the application done within that 45-day window. Even may be helpful to kind of give them some talking points ahead of time, things to come to the session with if you're helping them to complete the FAFSA. So they'll increase the likelihood of them completing their section after the student does their section. Lastly, student not signing and submitting after the contributor has completed their section. Again, this requires the student to be aware that the contributor has completed their section, to then go back in and then submit their part. We know there's going to be a lot of traffic for students going in and out of the application. In the past, we've only had to have the kid to log in once, and it's been a bit of a challenge for certain folks. So now that they have to log in more than once, it could be a bit cumbersome. So please, please, please stay diligent in supporting students and making sure that they are aware of the process and reminding them to go back in to submit the application after the contributor has finished their section. So how to best prepare for this new FAFSA? One, I encourage you again to review the FSA resources. They have a toolkit available online, and NCAN has a wealth of resources as well. Support families to create their FSA IDs. In the fall, I know I've been contacted by quite a few schools who had planned FAFSA nights because they weren't aware that the FAFSA wasn't going to be released on October the 1st this year. And they wanted to know just kind of what would I advise. And I say I would switch those nights to be FSA ID support nights to help families create an FSA ID. We know that could be a process sometimes. It could take some time for students students and parents to get the email, the verification email back from Federal Student Aid in creating their FSA ID. So if you can create an opportunity for them to do that before the FAFSA rolls out, then it'll decrease the amount of time it'll take them to complete the FAFSA when it actually comes out in December. Also, I encourage parents who are not U.S. citizens to apply for an I-10. An I-10 is a number, the same amount of digits as a Social Security number, that's usually attached to folks who file taxes in the country but don't have Social Security numbers. Anyone can apply for an I-10, but it takes a little bit of time to get one, about 7 to 8 weeks to get an I-10. I think this is an easy process for creating an FSA ID. If they create an I-10, they can create an FSA ID and move through the process to get the FAFSA done. Let me reiterate, it is not required to create an I-10. But if they don't have a Social Security number without an I-10, they will then have to go through the ID verification process with TransUnion. And if they can't use that process, then they have to then manually upload their documents on the FSA upload portal. I think it'll just be easier to get an I-10 and create an FSA ID and not have to work directly with Federal Student Aid in that regard. It's up to the parent, but I think it's a wise choice. Next, prepare for FAFSA nights in December and January. I know a lot of folks have been reaching out to me about FAFSA nights, which is great, in December and January. If you'd like us to come, by all means, reach out to me or my colleague Jason in our Alexandria office. We'd be happy to come if we have availability. But yes, start to plan those FAFSA nights in December or January, because we need to hit the ground running when the application is released. use this time to help students to complete those college applications and start scholarship applications. While we realize the timeline has shifted a bit, now we're just going to flip our attention to what they would have been focusing on in December and January, which is scholarship applications and finishing up those college applications. So get those things done before the FAFSA, or help students get those things done before the FAFSA becomes available. So those are less things they have to worry about then. Lastly, and I think it's super important, pack on patience and grace and abundance in this process. It's going to be new for all of us. We're going to be learning the website, training folks on the learning the application, training folks on the application, and helping parents and students through it at the same time. So it's going to be a heavy lift, but we can get through it together. I promise. We can get through it together. Once we learn it, once we understand it better, then we can best support families and students with accessing federal financial aid and state financial aid. So if you have any questions about it, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the College Place. We are a free resource here to help anyone with understanding post-secondary planning. I'm a financial aid expert, so any questions that you have about financial aid, federal, state, or institutional, please don't hesitate to reach out. We want to be of service to you. On the screen, you see my contact information. So please don't hesitate to reach out via email or phone if you have questions or if you need more support in understanding the Better FAFSA, the new Better FAFSA project. Thanks again for your time and attention. I hope this information was helpful and insightful. If the information changes in major ways before the FAFSA is rolled out in December, we'll do another learning session to bring those updates to you all. But otherwise, thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.